You're standing at the edge of a beautiful neighborhood lake, the kind of place you dream of when you buy a home, the sun reflecting off the water, everything calm and peaceful, and you're just enjoying a quiet moment fishing. When a week later you open your mailbox and your stomach drops, because sitting there is an envelope from your HOA, and inside is a $50 fine, not for leaving your trash cans out too long, not for having your grass too high, but for fishing in a lake that's literally in your own neighborhood. And here's where it gets wild, because when I called to ask what in the world was going on, the HOA president didn't apologize, didn't even sound embarrassed. He smugly told me the lake was for aesthetic purposes only, meaning you could look at it but you couldn't fish, couldn't swim, couldn't touch it. And then, with this arrogant little tone, he said, "If you don't like it, you're free to move." Free to move. That was the moment the story changed, because instead of paying the fine and walking away, I decided to fight back. And what I ended up doing not only shocked my neighbors, but completely destroyed the power the HOA thought they had. So let me take you through exactly how I went from being fined for fishing to owning the lake and banning the entire HOA from ever stepping foot on it again. And trust me, by the end, you'll be asking yourself what you would have done in my shoes. Now, here's where it gets even crazier, because my first instinct was to be reasonable. I went to the next HOA meeting thinking, maybe I could talk this out. I figured if I made a logical case, showed that fishing wasn't hurting anything, maybe even got a few neighbors to back me, they'd reconsider. But that meeting felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The board sat up front like they were royalty, and the moment I brought up the fine, they started smirking. One board member muttered, "Rules are rules." Another waved me off and said, "It's in the bylaws." And then the president, the same guy who told me to move, leaned back in his chair and said it again, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you don't like it, you're free to move." And that's when I made a silent promise to myself that I wasn't going to move. I was going to make them regret those words. Now pause and imagine this. You're sitting there being laughed at by people who think they have total control over you. What would you do? Most people would probably pay the fine, maybe grumble about it, and try to avoid more trouble. But me? I went home, opened my laptop, and started digging, because if there's one thing I know, it's that HOAs love to bluff. And guess what? I found out something they never wanted me to know. The HOA didn't even own the lake. They managed it, sure, but the actual deed still belonged to the original developer, a guy who, according to county records, had been trying to sell off leftover parcels for years. Suddenly a crazy idea popped into my head. What if I bought the lake? At first it sounded insane, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I owned the lake, they couldn't tell me what to do. They fined me for fishing. Well, I'd make sure they never touched that water again. And here's where the story takes its first huge twist, because when I called the developer and asked if he still owned the lake, he actually laughed and said, "Yeah, it's a headache. Costs money to maintain, insurance is a pain, I'd sell it tomorrow if someone made me an offer." I asked him how much, bracing myself for some massive number. But when he told me, I almost dropped the phone. It was less than the cost of a brand new truck. That's when I realized this wasn't just a daydream. This was possible. This was real. And within weeks, the paperwork was done, the money transferred, and the deed was mine. I had officially bought the very lake the HOA fined me for fishing in. And the best part, they had no idea what was coming. Now stop here for a second and picture the moment. You walk into the next HOA meeting with a folder under your arm. Everyone's expecting you to quietly sit down, maybe get scolded again. But instead you march right up to the table, lay down a stack of papers, and say, "You fined me for fishing in the lake. As of last week, that lake belongs to me. Which means if any of you step foot on it, you're trespassing." The room went silent. People's jaws literally dropped. The president went beet red, sputtering that it wasn't possible, that the HOA controlled the lake. But when I slid the deed across the table, stamped and signed by the county, the smirks disappeared. One board member actually stammered, "Wait, is this real?" Oh, it was real. The HOA had just lost the very thing they used to bully me, and now I held all the cards. And you might think the story ends there, but trust me, it was just beginning. Because HOAs don't go down without a fight. First came the angry letters, demanding I return the lake to community ownership. I sent back copies of the deed. Then they tried threatening legal action, claiming the neighborhood had easement rights to access the lake. But when my lawyer reviewed everything, guess what? There were no easement rights. They had been bluffing all along. For years, the HOA had acted like they owned the lake, but legally they never did. And when that argument fell apart, they tried a new tactic, fear. Rumors started flying that I'd have to pay insane taxes, that owning the lake would bankrupt me, that I'd be sued into oblivion. None of it was true, and the more they scrambled, the weaker they looked. And here's where karma kicked in. Because the lake wasn't just a piece of water, it was tied directly to property values. People bought homes here because of the lake lifestyle. The HOA bragged about it in their brochures. But now, with me fencing off the paths and putting up private property and no trespassing signs, suddenly that lifestyle was gone. And you know what happens when property values start to dip? Neighbors get angry. And not at me, at the board. People who once ignored me started approaching me at the mailbox, whispering, "Is it true you own the lake?" And when I nodded, they didn't glare, they smiled. Because they realized I wasn't the villain. The board was. By the time the next HOA election rolled around, the community was fed up. The entire board was voted out in one sweep. Gone. Replaced by people who were sick of the arrogance, sick of the power trips, and desperate to restore harmony. And then came the sweetest moment of all. The new board came to me, humbled, asking how they could regain access to the lake. I listened, nodded, and gave them one simple condition. End the no-fishing rule. The same ridiculous rule that started it all, the rule that got me fined $50, was gone forever. And today, I fish whenever I want. Sometimes I even invite neighbors to join me, just to watch the old board members sulk from their porches. And every time I cast my line into that water, I think about how close I came to just paying the fine and moving on. But instead, I turned the tables in a way nobody saw coming. And now, let me ask you, what would you have done? Would you have paid the fine and kept your head down, or would you have fought back the way I did? Drop your answer in the comments, because I love reading your stories, and who knows, your experience with an HOA might just end up in a future video. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, do me a favor. Hit that like button so more people can hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Imagine this. You're standing at the edge of a quiet lake, the sun glinting off the water, birds chirping in the background, and you're just enjoying the simple peace of casting a fishing line, waiting for that gentle tug that tells you dinner might just be swimming toward you. When suddenly, days later, you open your mailbox to find a crisp white envelope with the bold letters of your homeowners association stamped across the top. You open it, thinking maybe it's some community notice or upcoming event, and instead it's a fine. $50. Why? Because apparently, according to the HOA, fishing in your own neighborhood lake is against the rules. At first, I laughed. I genuinely thought it had to be a clerical mistake, or maybe even some bizarre prank. I mean, what's a lake for if not to fish in, swim in, or at least use for recreation? But when I called to ask, the HOA president didn't just confirm it was intentional, he told me, with this smug little tone, that the lake was for aesthetic purposes only. In other words, it existed just to look pretty, and no residents were allowed to fish, swim, or even so much as disturb it. I couldn't believe it. Here I was paying my HOA dues every month like everyone else, thinking those dues helped maintain the lake so people could enjoy it, and instead, I was being told it was basically a lawn ornament. And then came the kicker. The president actually told me, if you don't like it, you're free to move. That sentence burned into my brain. Free to move. As if it was that simple. As if someone could just uproot their life because a few power-hungry board members decided they didn't like the idea of someone enjoying the lake. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to pay the fine. I was going to fight back. And not just fight back, I was going to win. Now, I'll be honest, my first step was what any reasonable person might do. I went to the next HOA meeting. I figured if I showed up, made a calm, rational case, maybe even got some neighbors on my side, they'd see how ridiculous this was. But that meeting was like stepping into a courtroom where the jury was already against me. I brought the fine notice, I explained that the lake was listed in the community amenities, and I asked them why fishing wasn't allowed. And do you know what happened? They smirked. They actually smirked. One of the board members, without even looking up from his notes, said, "Rules are rules." Another one chimed in, "It's in the bylaws." And then, the president leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and repeated the same line he told me on the phone. "If you don't like it, you're free to move." At that moment, sitting in that stiff little meeting room, surrounded by people who thought they were kings and queens of the neighborhood, I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to end this ridiculous rule, and I was going to do it in a way that none of them would ever see coming. So I went home, pulled out my laptop, and started digging. I wanted to know everything about the lake. Who owned it, who controlled it, what legal rights the HOA actually had. And here's the crazy part one discovered. Most people assume their HOA owns everything they say they own, but that's not always true. Sometimes the HOA manages amenities, but the land itself still belongs to a developer or a third party. So I pulled property records, searched through county databases, even called a few offices just to make sure I was reading it right. And then I found it. The HOA didn't actually own the lake. The original developer of the neighborhood still did. And even crazier, there was a note in the records that the developer had been trying to offload some of his unused properties for years. That's when the idea hit me like a lightning bolt. What if I bought the lake? It sounded insane at first. Who buys a lake? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I owned the lake, the HOA couldn't tell me, or anyone else, what to do with it. Suddenly, their power would crumble. They fined me for fishing. Fine. I'd make sure they never touched that water again. So I made the call. I'll never forget the conversation with the developer. I asked him straight up, "Hey, are you still the legal owner of the lake behind our neighborhood?" He kind of chuckled and said, "Yeah, it's more trouble than it's worth. Costs money to maintain, insurance is a hassle, and I've been looking to sell it. Why you interested?" I nearly dropped the phone, but I kept my voice steady. "Maybe. Depends on the price." He gave me a number, and when I heard it, my jaw nearly hit the floor. Not because it was expensive, but because it was surprisingly affordable. Less than the price of a new truck. I realized right then and there that for the cost of what some people spend on a car, I could own the lake. So I pulled the trigger, signed the papers, transferred the funds. Just like that, the entire body of water that my HOA fined me for fishing in was now legally mine. And oh, you better believe I had fun with the reveal. At the very next HOA meeting, I showed up with the deed tucked neatly in a folder under my arm. They were in the middle of lecturing some poor guy about the length of his grass when I raised my hand. The president rolled his eyes like he didn't even want to give me the floor, but eventually he nodded, and I stood up. I laid the folder on the table, opened it up, and spread out the paperwork. Then I said, "You fined me for fishing in the lake. As of last week, that lake belongs to me. Which means if anyone sets foot on it without my permission, you're trespassing." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. One board member actually laughed nervously, thinking I was joking. The president's face turned red. Someone in the back whispered, "He's not serious, is he?" But I was. Dead serious. I showed them the deed, the signature, the county stamp. The same lake they fined me for fishing was now off limits to them, and the look on their faces was worth every single penny. Of course, they didn't just roll over. HOAs never do. They tried everything. First came the letters. Angry, threatening, official-sounding notices claiming the lake was still community property. I sent them back copies of the deed. Then they tried claiming easement rights, that residents had access by default. But when my lawyer looked it over, guess what? No such rights existed. The HOA had been bluffing for years. They'd acted like they controlled the lake, but legally, they never had a claim. Finally, when all else failed, they tried begging. And that, honestly, was the sweetest victory of all. Because here's what they hadn't considered. The lake wasn't just a pretty little pond, it was tied directly to the neighborhood's property values. People loved bragging that they lived on a lake. Without access, that bragging right disappeared, and home values started dipping. Suddenly, neighbors who used to glare at me for fishing were glaring at the board for losing their lake privileges. People started whispering in the streets, pointing fingers, demanding answers. The board was cracking under the pressure.